Happy Tuesday, May 19th, 6th graders. Today our lesson will be about the region of Venezuela in South America. I hope you are all doing well and enjoyed a nice weekend. It was a little rainy on Sunday, but hopefully it's getting better. Thank you for continuing to practice your Vikes, having good integrity and kindness to everybody in your family, and engage in your learning. I'm really excited for those that are still involved. All the best, Mrs. Reed. We'll go ahead and get started with Venezuela. This is a picture from the movie Up. And when you go through the slides, please watch this movie clip. The animators actually visited Venezuela to study the geography to get the animation is accurately correct to the geography. There's some pretty wild areas of Venezuela. They have highlands and they have tepuis that we're going to learn about. A geographic feature, the high flat land that you see in the movie Up, is out in the Guyana highlands and in Venezuela where there's tepuis, they call it, which is kind of cool. So Carl wanted to take his wife to South America, and that's the geography we're going to look at today. We're also going to talk about the culture and Venezuela's natural resources and how that affected its economy. What we need to know about Venezuela, Venezuela has one of the world's largest oil reserves, so their natural resource is oil. Venezuela found the oil, discovered the oil in the early 1900s or middle 1900s, and unfortunately, they had been primarily farmers before that, pretty self-reliant, living off of the land, but not really wealthy. So when the oil industry moved in, the nation at first, the government ran the oil and used the oil to rebuild, to build schools, to build roads, to build libraries and better hospitals. The money went back to the people. But eventually, companies came in like Shell Oil and talked them into privatization. So that's something that we're going to talk about today, to privatize that industry so that company owners made big profits, but the money didn't go back into Venezuela to make it better. But what happened during this time that's really important is Venezuela became very dependent on money from oil, which is great when there's a boom. So on the screen you see the word a boom, an economic time of increased wealth, so they're making lots of money. During which a product like oil, the prices are high, Venezuela is making lots and lots of money, increased profits. And so even if it's a company, even if it's privatized, it's good for jobs. The company is going to need lots of people working, and so the people in Venezuela were prospering when there's an economic boom. However, economies normally go boom or bust. And so they go up like a roller coaster and they go down like a roller coaster, and a bust is a downtime. Poor economic period where oil profits are really down, there's no profit, oil prices drop. We are in a big bust right now. It's great for drivers. Like we can see gas is like $1.25 right now. And people like that, except that on the world market, that really means the global economy has fallen. And so it's not as good for businesses and for our economy to keep going and for jobs. So in Venezuela right now, there is a huge, because it's been for about 2 years, prices in oil have kind of dropped and things have happened in Venezuela to create political things have happened, also a struggle between leaders, and they are having a huge economic and humanitarian crisis. And lots of people have fled from Venezuela, becoming refugees in countries like Brazil and Colombia. And it has created a lot of problems because Colombia and Brazil were not prepared to provide homes and to provide schools for these refugees that are fleeing the conditions of Venezuela. So we will talk a little bit more about that today. So a boom or a bust is a term you need to know in economics. So a boom is when you're making lots of profit. A bust is when the economy is down. Right now, our economy is in an economic bust. But a boom and bust are different than depression and recession. That describes the whole economy. A boom or bust is focused on one product like oil. So there's an oil boom and then there's an oil bust. So different times for that particular product. Lake Maracaibo is Venezuela's largest, and you'll see it on a map later, largest inland freshwater lake. It has huge deposits of oil underneath it and around it. So it's oil is a very valuable resource for the country, but also the fresh water is. So if you look at that picture at the bottom, you see some oil slick across there and there's oil wells. Those whites are not sailboats, they're oil rigs. So it creates some problems. You have to be careful in the balance of getting the natural resource for your economy and polluting your environment. And we're seeing that now as Corona has our economy kind of shut down. We're seeing places like China where the air is better. Water is going to be cleaner if they're not drilling for the oil at that time. So there is some balance between how we use our natural resources. We need to learn that balance and not polluting our environment because we want to be able to use the water, reuse the water as well. And then that privatization we talked about, if it's run by the government, it's a public service, and all the money, any profit or any money that was left over would just go back into things for the people, like roads, hospitals. When they privatized, a lot of the money then leaves Venezuela to these big companies like Shell Oil that are international, and the CEOs profit. It still provides lots of jobs and helps the economy of Venezuela and has for years, but not all of the money goes back in to provide and help make things better and fair wages and better benefits and health care for the people of Venezuela. So privatization, there's different sides to it, some good and bad. Here's a timeline of Venezuela's history that we kind of need to know. It was one of the first countries that Columbus visits, that he sailed on the coast. He didn't really go inland into it, but he thought it looked like Venice, Italy, where he had learned how to sail and grew up. And so that's where Venezuela gets its name. When we learned about independence, Simón Bolivar, you see a picture of him. He was from Venezuela and one of the first countries in South America to claim its independence from Spain. It was part of kind of Colombia, Venezuela at that time. In 1908 to 1935, it becomes the largest oil exporter. So they found it early in the 1900s. Right after World War II, because some of the leaders from Europe that were part of the Nazi Party and associated with Hitler, part of South America's history is that the Nazi leaders and dictators that were associated with Hitler, some of them fled and hid out in South America. And they become dictators in South America in different places. So there's some history connections there. Well, many of the countries in South America, especially after seeing what happened in Europe, and some of them sending soldiers over to help fight after World War II, which would have been right around 1945, they wanted democracies. They wanted to elect presidents and to establish and to have a democracy more like what they saw in the United States. In 1973, there was an oil boom, very high oil prices. So Venezuela was profiting. Things were good. They were investing in their country, educating their kids. In 1989, this is when the Soviet Union, the Cold War ended, and the Soviet Union's economy collapsed, which affected the whole global economy. And so there was a bust in Venezuela, a hard time. In 1998, President Chavez was elected. He takes over as president, but begins to act more like a dictatorship. He was only supposed to serve for 4 years, according to the Constitution of Venezuela. But he then, before the end of his term, rewrote the Constitution without the support of their legislature so that he could stay president longer. And when an election was held, people were often forced to vote for him or intimidated or harassed, or other votes weren't counted. So it was never a fair election, even though he called himself a president. He passed away unexpectedly in 2013 from a cancer. And he was also friends with Fidel Castro from Cuba. And he had many ideas for making Venezuela like Cuba, which was communism, where the government controlled the economy, but also to provide, he had grown up poor, Chavez did, and he wanted to provide like free education, socialism, kind of like what Europe has, where you pay a little bit more taxes, or if you have an industry like oil, the money would go for all the people. But he acted as a dictatorship. It wasn't a democracy with socialism. It was a dictatorship where just his ideas, and he wasn't listening to the people or letting people vote for how they spent that money or how the government controlled those services. So Venezuela was kind of a different situation, and socialism didn't work as well or wasn't as fair because you had a dictator with absolute power. So it didn't work like you had a democracy where people elected officials who worked for the common good, for the good of the people. When he passed away, his vice president Maduro took over. And since then, in the last few years, from 2013, 2017, there's been a struggle for power in Venezuela. And there is a man, Gallardo, who there was an election, who won the election, but who Maduro's people, he's not willing to turn the military over or to give up his office. So that's been part of the crisis. So that's a brief history of Venezuela. This is a little bit, read the slide carefully, just about Hugo Chavez and how he changed the Constitution, and Maduro, his vice president, who took over and tried to rule very much like Chavez, but didn't have the same kind of power or influence with the people, the support from the people. And so that's when Venezuela really fell into a huge crisis. There are going to be a couple slides with videos. Please make sure that you watch them carefully. This is one of my favorite. This is where the tepuis are. It's really interesting, the geography of Venezuela, so please make sure you watch that and listen carefully. Then there are going to be slides, just a few clips from the textbook pages, so read those carefully. You don't have to take any notes. You can take notes if it helps you. Just look at the map. Here's Lake Maracaibo, right up here, the biggest freshwater lake in Venezuela, and that's really important with the oil around it as well. So this talks about the oil, explains their natural resources, what happened with privatization, so kind of what I went over with the slides earlier. Just read them carefully. This explains the crisis that's happening now. There's an article from Newsella from 2019, February of 2019, so it's a year old, but it really kind of explains, and it's still going on. These things don't get resolved quickly. It explains what the rest of the world is thinking, who allies themselves, who's friends. Russia is working with Venezuela, and they're kind of creating tension between the U.S. again. We don't have a very peaceful history with Russia as well. When you finish reading the slides and watching the movie clips, please complete the 5/19/20 Venezuela check-in. Have a great day, guys.